Welcome back to Gray and Gritty. My name is LJ Winnefeld.
And my name is Sandy Winnefeld.
And it's been a little while since we've actually recorded something, Dad. We've been a little bit busy the last couple of weeks, but the world definitely hasn't stopped.
It has not waited for one moment. It's been exceptionally busy and crazy.
Absolutely. And there's been a lot of developments with Iran. I think that has been widely reported on. I don't think that a lack of Gray and Gritty has stopped people from getting the news there. But there were a couple of things that I wanted to touch on specifically about Iran, because there have been a couple of developments that I think play kind of into some of the realm of where we have some expertise, or at least have done some significant research. And the first one is blockades, and the second one is, what is the actual, highly enriched uranium material? What does that actually mean there in Iran? Everyone talks about 60%. I saw a post on Instagram the other day, someone trying to describe what 60% highly enriched uranium actually meant, with basically the comment saying, thank goodness that they haven't built any nuclear weapons yet, when I thought that 60% was not weapons grade, was not capable. But before we move to uranium, I want to talk a little bit about the blockades. As I think most of our listeners and viewers know, the United States has instituted a blockade as of about midday on Monday East Coast time. This blockade consists of, in the realm of just under a dozen ships that have been operating in and around the CENTCOM AOR over the last few months. There was reporting early on in this ceasefire that we're in that a couple of destroyers had transited the Strait of Hormuz into the Gulf, which I'm sure was a harrowing and interesting transit, especially with the reports of mines there. But now Donald Trump has moved to push a blockade on all Iranian ports. And we talked a little bit about this in the article that we released yesterday about blockades. But before I kind of jump into some of the nuances of the blockades, what is your thoughts, Dad, on instituting a blockade on Iran around the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, it was really interesting that we initially found ourselves in a position where Iran had essentially closed the Strait of Hormuz by threatening to send a missile or a drone after any ship that they did not approve transiting through the strait. And we still let Iran export their oil. In fact, we reduced the sanctions on their oil coming out. And I think that was a really tough call. It was sort of like, well, if we reduce Iranian oil coming out, that's going to be less oil on the world market. It's a commodity, so we don't want to do that. But then I think smarter heads prevailed and said, hey, wait a minute. We're letting Iran export oil, and our partners in the Gulf are not being allowed to do it. And I think in the wake, I was surprised they didn't do it sooner, actually, closing the strait. In the wake of the sort of temporary failure of negotiations in Islamabad, Pakistan last Friday, I think the administration said, okay, this military thing of taking out targets has kind of reached its nadir, where we've gotten 90% of the Iranian military capability. Getting that last 10% is going to take a massive amount of effort. So let's switch gears and now try to put the economic squeeze on Iran rather than the military squeeze. So the question now with this blockade is, who's going to blink first? If we even get that far, because it's going to take a while for the true effects of a complete closure of the Strait of Hormuz to have impact. It's going to impact the Iranian population, the Iranian leadership. It's going to impact the rest of the world. And who's more resilient is going to be the question. And I'm not so sure that it's the West. It might be Iran, because they have such tight control of their people. But it's worth trying. It may be some good negotiating leverage, because the markets are all up today, because the rumors are out there that there's going to be another round of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran in the coming days.
Yeah, I almost don't necessarily take the markets as a good indicator of where this conflict is going based off
They've
of
been all
the
over
roller
the
coaster.
place.
It's based off the latest narrative of what might be happening on the ground, but I think it's a good point. And another great point that you brought up is the effects of having a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz are probably not going to be felt for a while. And I mean, we've already kind of effectively had that to a certain extent, because not many oil tankers have transited, talking about 130 ships a day transiting through the strait during its peak. So I think there were 6 today. I think 6 made it through the blockade. They were allowed through by, obviously, the United States Navy, and I guess complicitly a little bit with Iran as well, if they were able to make it through the strait. But 6 as opposed to 130 is significant. But I don't think that a lot of people realize that these oil tankers are not like a cruise ship. They're not going to be steaming ahead, or like a Navy ship for that matter. They're not going to be steaming ahead at 15, 20, 25 knots. These guys are chugging along at about 5 knots or even less. And a good analogy that I heard from Max Fisher, he compared it to a bicycle. So imagine if you pedaled on a bicycle all day, every single day, about how far could you make it across the earth? And it's not that far. So I think that the effects of something like this, the effects of even a blockade where there's not really anything coming through now, are not going to be felt for a while.
Yeah, and there's from the very beginning, there was always the residual traffic that had made it through the strait and still had to reach its destination. And so once that stops, there will be an immediate sort of effect at that point. But the real long-term effect is, fertilizer leaving the Gulf is critically important to the world's agriculture. We've increased crop yields over the last 100 years by massive amounts, largely due to fertilizers and pesticides. When that gets cut off, those effects take all the way until a harvest, which will be months and months from now. And those are not easily fixable. So we're going to see some reverberations over the coming 6 months or so that are not going to be very pleasant, and that, frankly, the markets may not be accounting for right now based on their behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that the markets were up today on the word of peace talks, I mean, they're down overall since the start of this conflict. But I think the larger point there, right?
Actually, they're back up. The markets are
they actually?
The S&P 500 is actually back above where it was before the conflict, which is
so out of correction territory. Yeah.
And it's just amazing how the psychology of that works. The markets usually act in the best interests of the people there. It's kind of like a poly market kind of thing, right? But not always.
Yeah, and I think the larger point, right, because I think everyone inherently understands the fertilizer, and everyone's talking about all the different kinds of things other than just necessary oil that are coming out. But you brought up a really good point, is that the fertilizer piece may not be felt until the fall. Because a quick reversal of anything, let's say tomorrow or at these next talks, when J.D. Vance goes over there, completely solve everything, and everything gets opened right back up again. One, the cost of fertilizer probably won't come down all that much right away. The supply of fertilizer during this very, very important planting season around the world will not get to its destination in time to have the crop yield that you need in the fall. So we may have already, to use a pun, this ship may have already sailed with respect to the ability to have a strong crop yield across the world, or at least food that is still reasonably priced, because these farmers are going to feel the effects. And if we're going to subsidize that as a country, that's just more debt that we're going to have to take on to help support these farmers. So it's definitely a mess.
And the U.S. agriculture markets are a little less sensitive to fertilizer coming out of the Gulf than the rest of the world. I think it's 18% or something like that of our fertilizer is sourced to the Gulf, whereas other nations are much, and particularly in Asia, are much more dependent on that fertilizer coming out of the Gulf. So we'll see.
Well, if you talk about world, food supply, we're already kind of seeing a little bit of a shortage because Europe's bread basket in Ukraine has been effectively, they haven't been able to really do much with respect to agriculture there since 2022. So this is just adding further strain to the amount of food that's available. But one of the things I did want to talk about, though, was blockades themselves, because I think a lot of people throw around this term of blockade. The administration has explicitly called it a blockade, and I think there are some preconceived or maybe misconceptions about what a blockade is and how actually it operates. The first thing really here, and I'd love to get your thoughts after I'm done running through this, Dad, but blockades are very, very hard to enforce, and we wrote about this yesterday. But you have to have a certain number of ships on station to be effective, because you can say that you have a blockade, but if you actually don't have the assets there on station 24/7, then it's just a paper blockade. That means not just having the ships there, the sailors, the Marines, expending the fuel, but the maintenance cycles of these ships. I don't think people understand that when a ship is going to be deployed for an extended period of time, there's a significant maintenance cycle when it comes back to the United States, and you don't have that capability down the line. And the second piece of this is you also have to have really good intelligence about where the ships are coming from, what they're carrying, what flag they're under, if they're actually carrying what they say they're carrying, and what their destination is, which is a mammoth kind of lift. And I'm sure our intelligence community is all over that, but it's just another thing that makes this very, very difficult. Now, the second piece is... Go ahead. No, please, go ahead. We can jump into these one at a time.
To me, the real near-term critical aspect is one of the things you brought up, and that is the manpower. We've had ships over there a lot. They've spent a significant amount of time there. It's a fairly narrow choke point, so the traffic is funneled. But if you have to board these ships, that's not an insignificant effort. And hopefully, if you turn them around or force them into a port in Oman or something like that, then you don't have to do that. But it could be pretty manpower intensive if people start to actually try to bypass the blockade.
Well, and one of the missions that the Marine Expeditionary Unit does train to, albeit maybe not as one of their primary missions, their primary, quick response force, and crisis response, but they do train to do boarding. Now, not all the Marines do, right? Not all of the 5,000 are going to be capable of that, but they can provide some of that supplemental capability. But you're relying a lot on these Navy crews that are over there to conduct a lot of this. So it's a great amplification of the point for sure.
And the good news is most of these boardings, like 99, if not 100% of them, are not going to be opposed boardings. But you still have to take it seriously especially if it's an Iranian ship that's coming out. You don't know what's waiting for you when you land on that deck off of your helo, or you climb the ladder from your little boat, or what have you. So it will be grueling if they end up having to board ships.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine the message that the IRGC could send if you have Navy, United States Armed Forces board a ship that may not necessarily even be Iranian flagged, but somehow they're able to sneak a bomb onto an oil tanker and blow up an oil tanker while you have American forces on board. But the second thing that I want to talk about with respect to blockades is that blockades under international law, or at least widely respected rules and norms, are considered a act of war, essentially almost a declaration of war, which is part of the reason why during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy administration called that blockade a quarantine and not a blockade. And really kind of two reasons. One, they didn't want to have the comparison to the Soviets when they were doing a lot of stuff around Berlin and choking out some of East Germany, but specifically wanted to ensure that they were staying under that threshold of a declaration of war because they feared that it might draw in other people. So it is interesting to hear no rhetoric about whether or not, and again, the age of rhetoric may be gone because we're more and more living in the age of the rule of power, not the rule of law. But I do think that is significant.
Yeah, when I think you consider the sort of testing of international law, that calling this a blockade instead of a quarantine is, versus the testing of international law that the whole war was in the first place. It's small change. I mean, you're right. The rule of power, the rule of law, is dramatically changed over the last 4 or 5 years. With Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, gross violation of international law. You can even argue that taking Maduro out of Venezuela, as happy as we all are about that, was a violation of international law. And certainly, going to war with somebody right in the middle of a negotiation sounds like Pearl Harbor to me. But going to war with somebody right in the middle of a negotiation, where there's no real imminent threat, is tough under international law. So a blockade is just kind of like yet another brick in the wall kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but it is significant in and of itself. The last thing, real quick, too, typically in a blockade, you have people that are trying, the blockaded power typically tries to run the blockade. They try to run that gauntlet to get supplies out or in. And, we both kind of agree that you're probably not going to see that in this one, particularly with the oil tankers, because no oil tanker captain, no insurance underwriter, no company is going to want to push a very, very slow tanker through a blockade like this against the most powerful Navy in the world. So I don't think that you'll see anything with respect to that, which will make it a little bit unique.
Yeah, and the only sort of subset to that is because I agree with you. No, they're not going to try to run this blockade by using force or guile. What they may do is just send a tanker through the straits and dare us to stop it and see what happens. What are you going to now? The dog has caught the car. What are you going to do? And I think that's a low probability, but it could happen, and I think we'll deal with it accordingly. We'll just divert the ship into Oman.
Yeah. And I think there was some worldwide reporting today that a few oil tankers had gone through the strait and were met by U.S. Navy ships, and those were pushed, I think, like what you said, over to Oman. So I think that has actually already started to happen, and that I think I got that push notification literally less than an hour before we started to record. So.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, what I want to do is talk about one more thing with respect to Iran, and it is regarding the HEU, or the highly enriched uranium. We have talked about this a little bit in the past. There is a significant amount of 60% highly enriched uranium that is in Iran somewhere, whether it's under rubble, dust, whatever it may be. It is definitely still firmly inside Iran. And you brought something up about kind of what this 60% can do, what it means to actually have that. I know we've talked about it briefly, but I've learned some more things just even talking to you in the last couple of weeks about what this stuff is. So if you could elaborate a little bit on what this HEU is and what it means to have 60% enriched uranium.
First of all, enriching uranium is done in centrifuges, which are centrifugal devices which take the heavier uranium-238 and spin it out in sort of a tornado, and there's a little lip there where the uranium-238, which in a centrifugal way migrates to the outside of the stream, and it's evacuated where the lighter uranium-235 stays inside the centrifuge, and that's how it gradually gets enriched. And it turns out that at lower enrichment levels to get to the next level is much more time consuming and very much more difficult to do than at the higher ranges, and that's just the physics that requires that. So the International Atomic Energy Agency, they view anything over 20% enriched uranium to be highly enriched uranium, and it's a matter of concern because there's really only two things you do with uranium that is enriched beyond like 5%. One is you can make a very efficient nuclear reactor for a ship. You don't need anything higher than 5%, let's say, for a commercial reactor because they're so big and you can move the fuel in and out all the time. For a ship, you don't want to have to touch that thing for 15, 20 years. So you do very highly enriched up to 90 or 95% uranium. And of course, the other thing you can do with highly enriched uranium, really highly enriched uranium, is make a bomb. And typically, 90% is considered the threshold for making a nuclear weapon because you want to make a small nuclear weapon, one that's transportable easily, can be flown on an airplane, put in a missile, and that requires 90% or so enrichment. But you can still make a nuclear fission device at enrichment levels as low as 60%. The little boy bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in World War II was 80% enriched, not 90%. It was more of like an average where some of it was more highly enriched and some of it was less highly enriched, but taken all together, it was about 80%. And at 60%, you can make a very large weapon. It can't be the implosion type of weapon that most nuclear weapons today are. It has to be, like a gun type weapon where you fire a projectile of uranium into a mass of uranium and get that critical mass. And it's only going to yield about 2 kilotons, which is still a pretty doggone big explosion and would get the world's attention. So I don't know that Iran would actually make a weapon because it takes a lot of uranium at 60% to do that, about 120 kilograms, and they've only got about 400 kilograms. But the other point is that 60% can be made to 80% or 90% very quickly in centrifuges. And we do believe, what I've read in the open source media, is that there are uranium centrifuges that have not been found and taken out yet. So this is a concern, and it is the biggest sticking point in the negotiations last weekend, where the U.S. apparently is looking for a 20-year moratorium, and the Iranians want a 5-year moratorium. And there's a little bit of interesting dynamic here. My sense is that the Trump administration is really just trying to get back what Barack Obama had in his deal, which was actually a pretty good deal. It was a 10-year deal. And everybody said, well, it's going to expire in 10 years. But all you have to do is at the end of 10 years, you go, hey, we got to extend this thing or we're going to keep the sanctions on. Or we're going to restore the sanctions or whatever it is you want to do. So I think the Trump administration is trying to get two things that Obama didn't get. One is a longer period of time, and the other is to get Iran to actually give up that 60% uranium. If they can get that, that would be quite a good thing. But Iran is also trying to make the point that under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, under international law, they have a right in their mind to enrich uranium. And what we're asking them to do is to give up that right in exchange for something else.
Now, could you have them keep that right, but keep it to 5% and subject any of their facilities to some of the inspections that they probably already had under the IAEA, or maybe even more intense inspections of more sites? I mean, is there a way to have a watchdog there so that you can keep them to, having that right to enrich uranium, but for a fact, or at least 99.999% that they're not actually going to take it above 5%?
Well, that's why it's so important to get the 60% stuff out of there, because under the Obama deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran was actually allowed to enrich uranium, but only to a certain level, and there were cameras, there were inspectors that were very mindful of when they might violate that, and in fact, Iran did violate that up to 20%. So what you're looking for is a window. So if they only have it up to 5 or 10%, it would take them a long time to enrich enough uranium to make a bomb. And if you detect them breaking out, kicking the inspectors out, and you can sense that they're trying to create enough highly enriched uranium for a bomb. If they're starting from 60%, that's a really bad thing. They can do that very fast, like within a month. And if they're starting at 5 or 10%, it would take them much, much longer than that. So that's what you're looking for, is that window. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Trump administration is trying to get Iran to agree to never enrich any uranium at all. I don't think that's going to happen, but perhaps they can get a deal, a compromise deal, where we go back to what the JCPOA had.
Yeah, and that's that trope, I think, of everyone's heard, the Iranians are 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon. And the reason for that is that even if you remove some of that, if they have any 60% enriched uranium, it would take them, as you said, about a month to get there.
I still think that there's a little bit of there's hyperbole there, because it might take them 2 weeks to enrich the uranium up to the right level, but there's a lot of metallurgy involved, a lot of very careful machining. You got to put it in the bomb and all. So it may not be 2 weeks. It might be a bit more than that.
Yeah, and then you have to have a delivery device, which, it could be anything from an intercontinental ballistic missile to, just trying to find a way to get it somewhere quickly, or put it into just a dumb bomb. But one of the big things, too...
I'd also argue, LJ, that you may not need a delivery device right away. If you blow one up in the desert in Iran, people are going to go, uh-oh, what if they have one that they could deliver in a ship or, whatever. So yeah, it's good to have a missile or a plane that can deliver the thing, but just the act of detonating one is a huge deal.
Well, completely changes the narrative. Yeah, exactly, because with North Korea, it completely changed the way that we have interacted with North Korea ever since they tested their first ever nuclear weapon. But one of the big things with respect to these negotiations, and is when the Obama administration was negotiating the JCPOA, the JCPOA, that took them 18 plus months, 18 months to 2 years, with intensive conversations. And there was no high-level interaction, like direct face-to-face interaction between President Obama and the Ayatollah, or the president, or anybody. Now you've got very high-level interaction between the vice president and senior leaders from Iran. But I think that there's a lot of narrative and a lot of pressure right now to try to get a deal done within weeks or within months, where I think in reality, the intricacies of negotiating something like this, you could literally probably just fall back on the JCPOA with an extended timeline. But unless they do that, I don't necessarily see, even though there are high level, almost like summit level talks, I don't see a negotiated deal being completed for several months. What are your thoughts?
Well, so what is it, a week from today that the 2-week ceasefire will expire? And as
we're recording this on Tuesday, the 14th of April. Yeah.
And as almost always happens in a negotiation like that, people will take it to the wire. So don't expect an agreement this weekend. Maybe Tuesday night if everything goes perfectly. But the Iranians are tough negotiators, and they've got a lot at stake here. This is a defining moment for them, and it's possible. So then what happens after the ceasefire expires? And I really don't think that either side really wants to get back into kinetic hostilities. It wasn't doing either side any good in the end game. So there may be some face-saving, okay, I'll give you another week because we're starting to make some progress, and these Iranians that are at the table are a little more reasonable than the guys in Tehran, and we'll go ahead and give you another week, but boy, in a week we're going to do X, Y, or Z. You're going to see a lot of that brinksmanship, I think, over the coming days, weeks, months, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, social media, predictably has been all over this thing with different kinds of tropes and narratives. As I mentioned before on this podcast, there's a whole group of people as, nothing ever happens community, right? Where all of these threats, all of these, different thing. Oh, this is going to be the massive thing that happens in geopolitics, and that was kind of the trope around the strikes on Iran before they actually happened. And then there was all kinds of people on the other side dunking on those, nothing ever happens group because it's like, hey, something it actually happened this time. And then there's a whole group now that is at least somewhat within the veteran and active duty community on social media is war's over, by the way, because it's been declared this has been done, but there's still quite a bit of shall I say conflict still occurring over there, and I'm not holding my breath that this thing is close to being done. I really hope it is, and I hope that a lasting ceasefire happens and they can actually reach a deal in the next 2 weeks or next week, I guess. But I'm not super confident. I'm more firmly in the I don't think that this thing's over yet.
Yeah, I agree with you. We'll see. Anybody who tries to predict this thing is stabbing in the dark.